Welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam Cone, and I'm the host for today's episode. I'm so pleased to have with us today Haley Czarnek, the National Director of the Law Students for Climate Accountability. And with her is Jessica Rahmoune, a third-year law student at Boston University School of Law, and she is serving as the media chair for Law Students for Climate Accountability. Welcome to both of you. We're so excited that you're with us today.
Thanks so much, Pam. Excited to be here.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So let's start with you, Haley. When and how did Law Students for Climate Accountability get started?
Yeah, so Law Students for Climate Accountability came out of a wave of protests in early 2020 against the law firm Paul Weiss for their representation of Exxon. So I believe it was Harvard, Yale, NYU, Michigan. There may have been a few other campuses as well. And what folks realized as they were engaging in those protests is that obviously they were aware that Paul Weiss was doing work for Exxon, but they were not aware of the greater landscape of fossil fuel representation. And so folks were really interested in seeing a resource that would help give information about the role of the legal industry when it comes to climate change and the fossil fuel industry specifically. So a group of students at Yale decided to create the first law firm climate change scorecard. And that came out in October of 2020, so later in that year. And it received a tremendous amount of attention because they were absolutely right that there just wasn't information out there that was giving folks sort of access to the bigger picture about what firms were doing. There's a lot of information about, their ESG commitments, about their in-office sustainability programs, but of course they're not wanting to publicize their fossil fuel industry work. And so they created this scorecard ranking the Vault 100 firms around according to how much fossil fuel representation they were doing. And when they saw how much attention that received, they realized they could not just let the energy die there. They had to keep it going. And so after that, they decided to create a national organization. And so they brought together a group of students from across the country to be our first ever National Student Leadership Committee. And I was very, very fortunate to be on that committee and have since transitioned into our first full-time staff member. So that's a little bit about the story, but it's been a really, really amazing time for me.
So that's a great background, and it leads to my first question for Jessica is, how do law students throughout the United States learn about this, and how are they recruited? I imagine perhaps recruiting isn't too hard to get them to do some of this work.
Yeah, so as is sort of obvious from our name, we are, our law students. We have presence on a wide range of law schools throughout the nation. And it hasn't been, from the time that we've started, our presence has only grown exponentially. There's clearly a big interest in finding legal work that is compatible with students' values, especially as it relates to climate change. So we have worked very closely with students at different campuses to help organize their own sort of chapters. We provide some trainings. We have a lot of opportunities for students to get involved with our work in terms of our campaigns and our research. And so far, it's been a very successful, recruiting strategy. Aside from having our law student climate pledge, which folks can sign, there have been a lot of people who just want to be involved in terms of raising awareness about law firms' role in climate change and pushing them towards a just transition.
Mm-hmm. So Haley, tell me a little bit more. I noticed on your website, there's a law student climate pledge and there's a law firm climate pledge.
Right.
Tell me what the pledge is.
Right. So the reason we have two is because, of course, there's differences between the individual choices that folks make, whether they're a law student, a young associate, or a partner, and the structural choices that firms are making. And so the student pledge is really focused on getting law students to think about what their power and agency is, and a system that often tries to make us feel like we don't necessarily have a lot of power. Like we need to just sort of take the best job that's available to us because we've got maybe a lot of student debt or a family to feed. When in reality, you know, there is a lot of power and privilege that comes just by being a law student. So we want to get folks to realize that, and at the same time acknowledge their personal circumstances. So all of that is to say that the student pledge is framed from that perspective, and it asks students to, if it's within their personal and financial circumstances, choose not to work for a firm that's doing fossil fuel industry work. But if that's not a possibility, to think about how they can have conversations that push their firm away from fossil fuel industry work. And so we try and really, you know, walk that line of understanding that we want to see behavior changes at these firms, and that is not the same thing as wanting to shame individuals for their choices, right? We want to get them to realize that they can be upset that these are the choices that they've been forced to make, not make them feel like they've done the wrong thing. So we've been very careful about how we structure the student pledge for that reason. The firm pledge is, I think, a lot more crystal clear, which is that we just ask firms to move away from fossil fuel work. And so there's two parts of the pledge that we ask them to take. One is to stop taking on new fossil fuel industry work. And the second is to phase out any existing work that they have by 2025. So those are the two pledges that we have. Currently, we have 15 law firm signatories, and none of them are Vault 100 firms, but we're really, really hopeful, number one, to expand the list of firm signatories, and number two, to get Vault 100 firms to start signing on as well, particularly because what we found through doing this research is that for the vast majority of firms that are in the Vault 100, the amount of profit that they are making from their fossil fuel industry work is tiny compared to their revenue overall. And so they really do have the power to say no. And in fact, if they make some of these public commitments, they're going to get new clients who are really interested in having a values-aligned firm. And we've heard from several firms that they are hearing from their clients just as much as, if not more, than they are hearing from students who are going through the recruitment pipeline. Although we have also heard from firms that they are hearing questions about their scores in these interviews as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. You've mentioned twice the term fossil fuel industry work. And my guess is that there are some law firms who say there's a big difference between working for fossil fuel industry clients and prolonging the status quo, or working for fossil fuel industry clients and helping them transition to renewables, as an example. Does your scorecard treat those examples of fossil fuel industry work differently? Or is any work for fossil fuel industry clients tagged the same way?
No, it does treat them differently. So Jessica, feel free to tag on to this answer at the end, but just to give a brief overview of our methodology, we look at three categories of work. One is litigation, one is lobbying, and one is transactions. And transactions is where it gets a little sticky. It's pretty obvious that if you're lobbying for a fossil fuel organization, that you're doing pretty direct harm. You're directly making sure that fossil fuels can continue to be used. And when it comes to litigation, we use climatecasechart.org, which is put together by the Sabin Center, and they take a look at cases in which climate change is a material issue of law or fact. And so every case that we're looking at has climate change at the center of it, just based on the fact that that's the resource that we're using to gather that data. Transactions are where folks have a lot more questions because, is it just about that it's a Chevron transaction, or is it that it's a fossil fuel transaction? And the answer is that the database that we use, IJ Global, categorizes each transaction based on the nature of that transaction. And that's how we look at the data.
So there's a possibility that you could get a plus in the column for doing certain types of work, and perhaps a minus for doing other types of work for fossil fuel industry clients.
Right.
Okay. Jessica, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one thing that we also do is in considering both sort of the fossil fuel work that perpetuates climate injustice versus, helping fossil fuel industries with other work. We don't count what we call the climate change mitigating cases as offsetting the exacerbating cases, because while that mitigating work is great, it doesn't necessarily cancel out the harmful aspects of the exacerbating cases. So mitigating cases do contribute to the firm's overall score, but it doesn't like offset the
Right.
negative work that they do.
Yep, that's a very good point. So you mentioned the methodology. Has it changed since the beginning? Has the methodology and the factors that are being considered changed since your initial report card?
Yeah, so we put out the third iteration of the scorecard, and it's been pretty consistent to date, but we are thinking about how we revamp it a little bit. And I think it's difficult because I think one thing that we all understand is that there is no one perfect way to say, this is the single worst law firm doing the worst fossil fuel industry work, or this is the single best firm doing the absolute best for climate that it possibly can. That just doesn't exist. We can't find that perfect methodology that everyone in the world is going to think is great. And so we do the best we can, and we make choices that we think are consistent with our values. And so one of those choices, as Jessica just mentioned, is that we don't allow, quote unquote, good work, so renewables work, environmental justice focused work, to cancel out the bad work, because you can't unwrite the harm of getting a pipeline in the ground just by then representing, a client that's been harmed pro bono, right? You can help them maybe get a financial settlement, but they've still ultimately been harmed. And so that's one of the choices that we make. But in terms of like how we look at very specific cases, there's all of these different emerging technologies that are really complicated, and folks completely disagree on the impacts that they might have, right? And so that somebody might say, well, this is moving us away from oil and gas. And somebody else might say, well, actually, it is still using a small amount of oil and gas, and what it's allowing that company to do is to exist for longer and use fossil fuels for longer than they would have otherwise. So it's ultimately doing more harm. So there's lots of really complicated questions, some of which I think we'll ultimately end up answering in our methodology, and some of which we won't. Some of which we'll probably end up saying, we can't tell you whether or not this project is going to hurt or help the climate. We don't have, very often there's such a limited amount of data that we can see to begin with. And even if we had access to all the data in the world, none of us are, like pursuing a PhD in that particular kind of case to be able to tell you with complete confidence what's going to happen, right? And so anyways, all that is to say, we do the best that we can. We are really, really working to get even more precise with our methodology. And we've even been engaging with as many firms as we can to get their feedback on our methodology as well, because, they're the ones that are doing this work. And if they have thoughts on how we can make it better, we want to hear it. And so it's still a bit of a work in progress what the fourth iteration will look like. But overall, it should be structured similarly, because we really stand by the idea that environmental justice should be guiding what we're doing, and that particularly, we're very happy for firms to go out and advertise their own good work, but that's not our job, right? Our job is not to say, look at all this good work that they're doing, right? Our job is to say, here's how we as a legal industry are impacting climate change and are interacting with the fossil fuel industry. And so that's part of what guides our methodology, and will continue to do so. Although, like I said, we're very much in a process of iteration and figuring out what this next one will look like.
You mentioned something about working with some law firms. What has been the reaction from the time you initially released the first scorecard to now? And I have my own observations, but I'm curious to hear from those of you who are at the core of issuing this scorecard. How has the reaction to it evolved over the last 3 years, 4 years? So
I don't know if I can speak to necessarily an evolution in responses, but I can tell you sort of the range of responses that we get. A lot of times, if we are talking to someone who's in more of an ESG role, or they're on a sustainability committee, it doesn't necessarily matter what score their firm is getting. They're still excited about the work that we're doing, because they are in a position where they want to be able to leverage our work to push their firm in the right direction, right? So across the different categories of the scorecard, there are folks in firms who are really, really excited about the work that we're doing and are happy to collaborate with us, to help us however they can, and to have conversations with us. And of course, at the same time, there are firms that very vehemently disagree with what we're doing. And one of those disagreements that we hear often is like, but we do all this renewables work. Why, would you then give us a D or what have you? And as I said before, it just goes back to, that's great. Go advertise your renewables work, but that's not the purpose of our scorecard, right? We're not trying to get press for your renewables work. That's on you. So, there's really a wide range. Some folks have given us really, really thoughtful insight about our methodology, about what types of sources we can use to get data, where things might be missing, what types of edge cases we should be considering, and how we should score them. And then, of course, other folks sometimes they'll kind of act like they want to give us feedback, and then they'll just be mad that they got a low score, right? And you know, we're willing to engage in conversations across the spectrum, right? Because all of it is information to us. And I think, we don't feel defensive because we're really excited to hear from people, right? We're never going to turn someone away just because they're upset or have a difference of opinion. Those things only inform our work to make it better and more precise. So that's a bit of a rambling answer. Did you have other thoughts, Jessica?
So I'll pose this next question to Jessica is, what has been the reaction on campus in the law schools? Obviously, you have one example at Boston, but generally speaking, what can you extrapolate with respect to how law students are feeling about this work?
Yeah, so I think one of the outcomes of sort of opening up this discussion is that students seem to be really interested in finding work that is compatible with their values. Climate change is really important for most of us. And I think there's just sort of been this reckoning as we sort of like held the mirror up to like the legal industry in terms of just reckoning with our impact on climate change, our impact on different communities in different ways. And so I think a lot of people are now excited to have this sort of information available to them because they can make more informed choices. And I think there's also sort of like, because it's, law school and like the legal industry, there's also some levels of like pride and prestige when you're like going to an A firm or going to a B firm over like a D or F. So we see a lot of students who use the scorecard to make their decisions when it comes to choosing big law firms for their summer associateships or postgraduate employment. I think it's also sort of opening the door in terms of a discussion about what the actual implications are, the practical implications are of our work as attorneys. I think at least for a while, it felt like, our work was sort of morally neutral, that we were just facilitators and providing legal answers to, or just sort of giving the legal knowledge to our clients who could then use it for whatever purpose or to facilitate our client's purpose. But I think now with LSCA and the work that we've done, there's been more of a discussion about like what are the practical implications of our work as attorneys, either in terms of its impact on climate change or its impact on labor or like other social justice issues. And that sort of like discussion wasn't really present, at least not during my 1L year. And in fact, like I also often felt like I was kind of crazy for like even thinking about things like this and thinking about the law critically. But now I feel like there's a lot more space to talk about this and a lot more people who are willing to engage in it and to seek out opportunities that are compatible with their values and to also push the current like legal employers to be mindful of like their impacts and in the work that they do, because it is really important and our work isn't just sort of siloed in that way.
I couldn't agree more. And anybody who knows me knows that I often will refer to the societal impact of a law firm really has nothing to do with their pro bono program or their volunteering or their charitable giving, and everything to do with the work they do day in and day out for their clients. That is exponentially much greater societal impact than any of the other things I just mentioned. And yet for too long, law firms have completely discarded that. They don't even talk about that in their reports for their corporate social responsibility report or what have you. So I think this is definitely helping to move the needle and helping law firms recognize the impact and the potential impact they could have in this moment in time when society is at a tipping point of how are we going to evolve to the next in order to survive, right? This isn't, and when I use the word sustainability, I think about it in much more than just the green term. I think about it viability. What do we need to do as a society to stay viable long term? And you know, I think lawyers have a huge role to play. So I'm applauding all the work you're doing, even though right now it applies to climate. I see in the future there could be other scorecards and evaluations of the greater societal impact that the professions are having.
Right. And we've actually had a couple of points on that. We've had folks reach out to us about wanting to do similar scorecards on different issues. So Jessica mentioned labor, but we've had people reach out about labor specifically. So we're really excited to see folks do different iterations of this work outside of the climate sphere. But I also really, really appreciate your point about pro bono, because that is something that we hear a lot. And I think it's also relevant to things like in-office sustainability programs. Like it is super great to reduce the amount of paper that you're using, but there's no amount of paper that you could save that's going to undo the harm of putting a pipeline in the ground. And it even goes beyond just sort of the amount of pro bono work that you're doing, because it's not just that it's a small amount of the overall work that a firm is doing. It's also that because of conflicts of interest, you are never going to be doing a pro bono case that directly, addresses the harm that you've helped cause, because you're conflicted out of those cases. And so there's a very clear slant when it comes to pro bono cases to do things like asylee representation, for instance, which is amazing. And of course, people deserve that representation, but it's also in part because that's not going to usually implicate conflicts of interest with your big business clients.
Right.
And so you just cannot pro bono your way out of this problem. It's just not possible.
No, and I also don't mean to be disparaging of pro bono work. I'm not saying these things are mutually exclusive. What I'm saying is all of that good work should continue, but don't forget about the other 99% of your societal impact, right?
Exactly.
So we have a few minutes left. I would love to hear from both of you, and let's start with Jessica. What do you see on the horizon for LSCA? What's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years, let's say, or if that's too long a horizon, let's just go with 3 years.
And you're talking about LSCA specifically, right? Okay. Well, we have tons of plans. We are very intentional about the work that we do and how we can sort of expand our reach, but also working with frontline communities. And we're hoping to launch a project soon that tells the stories of the impacts that law firms have had on various individuals or communities, and sort of painting out the picture of what exactly the work is and what it looks like in practice, and who is harmed by the work and how are they harmed. So I think that sort of goes to, it helps contextualize a lot of the work that we do so that you can see the sort of practical implications of legal work. And we're hoping that will come out soon, but we're working on it. And then we've also been working a lot more in terms of talking with firms to get more signatures on our law firm pledge, and having conversations with the Vault 100 firms, but also other local firms that have presences, like bigger presences in their region, especially in their environmental work. So we're trying to increase our outreach with those firms to have those conversations about their impacts and how we can sort of persuade them to not be so active in like the fossil fuel industry in particular. Yeah, I think that's so far been our goal. But we have a lot more that Haley has also been working on, who's been just doing tremendous work in terms of organizing.
Well, certainly if you can't tip your hand on some of these forthcoming things, I understand. But Haley, what's your predictions for the next 3 years for LSCA?
Yeah, I would second Jessica that I would really love to see a lot of firms sign on to that pledge, because I think that's going to help create a tipping point for the industry. And I also am really excited to see what organizing looks like on campus, because I think sort of the ethos of current legal culture is really really in conflict with the idea of organizing at all. It really wants us to be hyper competitive, to be individualistic, to be comfortable stepping over each other, to amass the greatest amount of social capital that we can. And that is just not compatible with building the world that we want to see. We absolutely have to work together and create these solutions globally, right? We can't individually fix this climate change problem that we created collectively. And so that's what I want to see, is an organizing ethos sort of saturate the law, and people feel like, I don't want to do this individual thing. I want to be in community with people who share my values, because I understand that the work that I do absolutely matters and it has a huge impact. And so I'm going to go seek out people who feel similarly and try and push this profession to be compatible with our continued survival, right? There's no more or no less than us continuing to have a legal industry to practice in at all. And so that's what I want to see. I want to see, campus chapters popping up and having conversations. I want to see them, talking to these local firms and figuring out what climate commitments they can make, even if they don't sign the pledge right away. I want to see this conversation really permeate the legal industry as a whole, both in terms of wanting to move away from the fossil industry, but also wanting to move towards something else, towards something that brings us together around a common purpose, and makes sure that we continue to have, this one shared home as a place that we can all live in.
Hear, hear. Cheers to that. I will definitely have you both back. And I'm not going to wait 3 years, but we'll talk again in a year just to get an update. Thanks to both of you for sharing the mission and the purpose of Law Students for Climate Accountability. You're doing great work. I, for one, am excited about what you're doing, and I would love to see it continue and thrive. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Pam.
Thank you.